Greetings, everyone. We'll wait just a couple minutes to make sure that everybody is in and connected. We have a large group here today, so just one more moment, make sure everyone gets in. All right, welcome all to NAPC's Preservation Month webinar on housing and historic preservation. This is a joint webinar with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. We're thrilled to welcome both the Advisory Council and NAPC audiences today, and we'll be providing brief background information on both organizations. I'm Barbara Howard, an architectural historian in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today. I'd like to take a few moments to get everyone oriented to this webinar platform. Like other platforms, you have access to a Q&A, a chat, and polling function. These are all tabs at the top right of your screen. If you'd like to minimize them, you can click on that downward arrow at the upper right corner of your screen. And then when you'll inevitably want them to come back up, there's a blue chat button at the bottom right of the corner for you to click. To view today's presentation in full screen mode, hover over the presentation and click full. If you experience any technical issues, use the private chat function and send a message to the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, and we'll try to troubleshoot for you. This session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. As a registrant, you will automatically receive access to the recording a few hours after the session is completed. And now just for a few housekeeping items. As you can see, continuing education credit instructions are listed on this opening slide. You'll also find these instructions repeated throughout the presentation in the chat tab. We invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll get to them as time allows at the end. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function. If someone else asks a question there you'd like to hear an answer to, you can also give that question a thumbs up and upvote it, and it will move to the top of the list. If time runs out, we'll be focusing on those highly upvoted questions for responses. The National Alliance of Preservation Commissions is committed to providing a welcoming space that encourages collaboration, discussion, and the sharing of ideas and points of view. Note that by attending, you agree to the following code of conduct. It's also on the screen. Please exercise consideration and respect toward presenters and participants in both your speech and in your actions. Attempt collaboration before conflict. Refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech, and be mindful of your surroundings and of your fellow participants. Now I'll ask each speaker to just briefly introduce yourself. We'll start with Sara Bronin.
Everybody, I'm Sara Bronin, the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and really pleased to be here with one of our observer members, the NAPC.
Great, thanks, Sara. Abby?
Hi, I'm Abigail Christman. I'm a principal city planner with the City and County of Denver, and then I am also currently the chair of the NAPC board. So super glad that we could get together to do this joint webinar with ACHP today.
Thanks, Abby. Adrian, how about you next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Adrian Scott Fine. I'm with the Los Angeles Conservancy. I'm the president and CEO, and then I'm often working with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions as a camp trainer. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Adrian. Cindy, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Alnick. I'm a communications consultant specifically for historic preservation and heritage conservation. And I'm the author of the messaging guide that I believe we're going to mention later on. So I'm just here to answer questions about that. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to be shutting off my camera now, but you'll see me both in the chat and in the Q&A throughout, and I'll come back on toward the end of the presentation to look at the questions that are coming in. All right, let's get started. Sara, I believe you're first.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. And I think I should be able to share my screen here. I'm going to put this on large all screen format. I am here to talk from the federal perspective on housing and historic preservation. And first, I was asked to just briefly talk about what the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is. It is an independent federal agency based in Washington, D.C. Our members are critical to know as part of our council, 24 members. We have 9 federal agencies and the architect of the Capitol, 8 presidential appointees. I'm a full-time member, the only full-time member actually on the council. We have a governor, a mayor, and a tribal member. And we also have 3 organizations that sit on the council. So the National Trust, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and NAPC. And I know that some of you, as I'm looking through the names on the call, are familiar with each and every one of these organizations. Of course, we also have observers. So I've appointed a few observers to serve on the council, but the national NAPC has been one for many years. As a federal agency, our functions are delineated by Congress. And so the 2 big ones, probably the first one is the one that you know, or you may interact with us most, especially if you work at the state or city government level, and that is the Section 106 review process. That process, and I'll have a slide about that, is really directed to federal agencies and their actions. But we also have, as the word advising suggests, an advisory function. So we're supposed to advise the president and Congress and state and local governments on preservation policy. So just briefly on Section 106, since I'll be talking about it in the context of housing, here's the key language. It requires federal agencies to take into account the impact of their actions on historic properties. And those are properties that are on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. When we adopt a policy statement, so shifting from our regulatory side to our policy side, we have our members involved, we have the general public, we have tribal and Native Hawaiian organization consultation. Of course, we have state historic preservation officers. And then finally, at the end of that process, the advisory council votes. So what I'm mostly going to talk about today is this part of the process, this part of our agency, and specifically a housing policy statement that we adopted in December of 2023. And one question you might have is, why a housing policy statement? Why would the federal government get involved at that intersection of housing and historic preservation? You probably have seen stories like this all the time. And my daughter's home from school today. I don't know if you can hear her, but you've probably seen articles like this, which really talk about preservation being the enemy of change, or preservationists being sort of not creative, extremely rigid. And the reality is, if you look at preservation and how it's evolved over the course of decades in this country, preservationists are the most creative, the most flexible, the most problem-solving group out there. I mean, many of you who have been involved in conversions of historic buildings to housing know exactly how complicated some of the technical, material, and of course the regulatory issues are. And the fact that despite those hurdles, preservationists have done so much to create housing is, I think, part of what we need to better communicate. And I know Cindy and Adrian will talk to us more about that. But it's this rhetoric out here that I think, is problematic for preservation. And I think it's important for this federal agency to continue to keep up the drumbeat for the kind of recognition that we have as preservationists, that we know there's a housing crisis. We know that reusing buildings is part of the solution. We also recognize, again, there's that perception out there that preservation is a barrier to development. So how do we overcome that? And part of that is showing through our own actions and our own statements of understanding that we're part of the solution too. And that's where a policy statement comes in from us, because our council is so diverse, representing so many different entities. I really felt, and our council felt, because we all voted for it, that this was an opportune time to refresh an older, a narrower policy statement, and to expand the intended audience beyond federal agencies, but also to include state and local governments, private parties, community groups, developers, just to say, here's what at the national level preservationists are thinking about. So the policy statement itself, the last one was adopted in 2007 on housing. This one adopted in, as I said, December of last year. These are simple documents. This one I think is about 10 pages long. It has 13 policy principles embedded in it. And here are the big categories. And I'll go through a few of them in my slides, just so you have a sense of the kinds of things that we talk about. We actually put private activity, the historic tax credits first, following through some maybe more technical areas, and including in number 9, section 106, and number 8, 9, actually 7, all those are about our federal permitting and federal statements about what preservation is, and then broadening back out towards the end. So I'm going to go over a few of these. And I'm going to start with this one, which is just across the board. The overarching goal of our policy principles are to encourage rehabilitation and to assist in harmonizing historic preservation and housing goals. So this seems pretty basic, probably to everybody on this call, but our statement of this in the policy statement set the tone for everything else and every other sub-principle that we included. When we think, for example, about reusing historic buildings, there are lots of different ways to go about that. One is through incentives. So we as a council have a unique ability as a federal agency to actually send our opinions to Congress and advocate. We're independent of the White House. We're independent of any other agency. And that gives us a little unique power in that we can do that. And every single year, at least that I know of, when there's a historic tax credit bill on the table, if it's for historic tax credits, the advisory council always communicates to Congress that it supports the creation and expansion of incentives to promote rehabilitation. So we that's why that one was front and center. And we sort of knew that one that has to continue in order to support, that has to continue at the federal level to support projects happening in each and every one of your neighborhoods. We also noted that there was an issue integrating historic and low income housing tax credits. And by the way, renewable tax credits as well at times. We put in there that government needs to do a better job of supporting weatherization and, of course, renewable energy, as well as environmental hazard mitigation. There are provisions in the policy statement that touch on areas where state and local governments and even private parties are making decisions. So we talk about zoning, we talk about building codes, and we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. As for zoning, one of the things that we push for and support, and I know the LA Conservancy, I'm sure Adrian's going to talk about that and others do too, is this idea that greater density has actually always been a hallmark of historic neighborhoods. Adrian told me about at our LA Housing Roundtable about the fact that that historic neighborhoods are typically denser in LA than non-historic neighborhoods. So, viewing this in sort of the historical context, this idea of density is not something that preservationists have ever really shied away from. And so we state that in the policy statement and say that we support zoning changes that add ADUs, help to facilitate infill development, help to facilitate office to commercial conversions. You would not believe the number of communities that still, even in their downtowns, bar those kinds of conversions by prohibiting or making it harder for rehabilitation and for housing to occur. We talk about multifamily housing. If you look at historic buildings, a lot of them change from single family to multifamily back to single family. That kind of flexibility and evolution within the buildings themselves is something that we see again, over the course of historic preservation, and especially its use in cities. Mixed use zoning was another thing. We heard from from Main Street America. We've heard consistently that idea of mixed use zoning, especially on historic main streets, is critically important. If we have better zoning there, we can also encourage housing. Building codes and accessibility requirements. I'm sure many of you have in your own practices seen that sometimes there are conflicts. So when building codes say, well, you have to have this stair, or you have to comply with this level of energy code and energy efficiency, historic buildings sometimes are exempt. It's the building inspector may not know. The same is true for compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We put our thumb in the scale in the policy proposals on accessibility. So we are hopeful that there is always a good design solution, or at least most always. And as for building codes, consistent with the climate and historic preservation policy statement we passed last year, we're hopeful that we can help put the thumb on the scales for energy efficiency as well. So those are the things in the policy statement that relate to these areas. Drawing from that energy focus, we talk in the policy statement about energy solutions. And again, here, you know, in your projects that when you want to convert an old building to housing, you have to make sure that it's comfortable for residents. And you also have to make sure that if it's a developer with a long-term operations budget, that they're able to make their buildings energy efficient so they don't have to pay a lot of money on electricity when they can help it. So energy focused retrofitting, renewable energy installation, thinking about the kinds of standards that we have sometimes imposed upon ourselves that result in conflicts between both energy efficiency and renewables, and the goal of enabling comfortable rehabilitations of buildings. We need to recognize those and really work on them. There's a whole part in the policy statement too about federal buildings, and I know this is an audience of local commissioners and others, but I just want to flag that we do encourage federal agencies to lead by example, by outleasing, lead by example in terms of the decisions they make with regard to buildings they don't outlease, that they keep in their own purview. And then the big one within our purview as an agency is project permitting at the federal level. So what we said in the policy statement there was that we wanted to expedite the process for reviews for projects at all levels, especially in the area of Section 106, so that we are focused on those qualities that make historic buildings significant. In other words, focused on the character defining features, and not as focused on these myriad other later additions, interior configurations that might not be as significant, and that with our unnecessary focus on them might actually be detracting from rehabs. When it comes to Section 106 in particular, and again, some of you may have been involved through your certified local government in 106 issues at the local level. But at 106, we talk about the focus should be on exteriors of historic buildings in historic districts. This is excluding national historic landmarks or individually listed districts. We talk about the practical, flexible integration application of the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. We discuss the need, we call upon ourselves to streamline processes through what we call programmatic approaches or alternate permitting procedures. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but anyway, I just want to note we called on ourselves to do it. And we really overall try to say that through the 106 process, we have to balance the need for housing with historic preservation, focusing on what's important and not focusing on what's not important. In that process, of course, we have to continue to consult with those who have been disproportionately impacted by the variety of social and economic conditions that have led to inequality and lack of access in public decision-making. So that could be tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, people with disabilities, disadvantaged and underserved communities, and what we have defined as environmental justice communities, CEQ, and the White House has defined. So with that background as to what is included in our policy statement, you might be asking, okay, well, how if you put out these statements, do you go about implementing them? And I'll just talk briefly about 4 things. So one is incorporating those statements into our 106 process. We are pushing for more flexible federal historic preservation standards. We are trying to inform state and local decision making, and through events like this, we're trying to raise awareness about just the existence of the policy statement. And what I think is a return to, through the statement, is a return to the core values of historic preservationists in this country, values that I think are sometimes obscured by rhetoric. And again, you got an expert coming up to talk about that, and so I won't harp on that topic. But Section 106 enhancements. So we are at our committee meetings this month. I am working with HUD and other agencies to try to push for a government-wide approach to housing. We have a lot of piecemeal types of housing that are covered by Section 106 program alternatives, mostly program comments. It's a kind of program alternative that goes through a particular process where ACHP votes to allow for certain types of federal actions to undergo particular processes. So anyway, my I guess the short of it is we are working now to try to implement the principles in our policy statement into a government-wide program comment on housing. You'll hear more about that soon. We'll be doing a lot of public engagement and consultation on that. As well as program comments on renewable energy and energy efficiency in some form or fashion. We're hashing that out, but stay tuned because this is going to be a very busy spring and summer for us. We are also hoping to better communicate what is an adverse effect. So whether that is trying to communicate what interior changes could be an adverse effect, exterior changes, we could do that through guidance, or we could do that through this tool called the program comment. When you think about federal historic preservation standards, virtually every commission in the country, and again, I know there's others on the call who are not members of local commissions, but virtually every commission in the country ties their decisions to the Secretary of the Interior standards on the treatment of historic properties, usually the rehab standard. We did a call for comments, and many of you participated in that last summer, where we heard from a lot of people about, including local commissioners, about how these standards were not clearly weren't clearly understood by people who had to apply them across the country, and understood as to how to weigh competing values. If you look at the regulations, if you look at the Historic Preservation Act, both the regulations for the standards and the Historic Preservation Act talk about the standards as being, especially the rehab standard, needing to be applied in a bigger context. Particularly economic and technical feasibility. And nowhere does the rubber hit that road more than in housing conversions. So ACHP is working on our part because we, through our Section 106 agreements, do provide guidance for Section 106 related practitioners on a wide variety of topics. Feel like now is the time for us to step up and, at least for our group of topics, provide much clearer guidance as to what satisfies the idea of an adverse effect. In our regulations, an adverse effect is something that, among other things, something that violates the Secretary's standards. So we're going to do what we can to implement the policy statement principles of the standards. It's missing words there in the second bullet point. We've also been out advising. So thank you to our friends in Charleston for this, for an invitation to come talk about zoning, housing, and climate. We have issued new advice to a variety of legislatures, including the Florida legislature and the Connecticut legislature. We do that upon request. So I'll just point out this URL, state_and_local_legislation. A little bit of a mouthful. But I encourage you, if you are having a specific issue on draft legislation, that's what the National Historic Preservation Act says we need to advise on. And so if we get a request through that website, we are very happy to weigh in if it's something that we can weigh in on. And I would say we weigh in when we can help describe our policy principles, whether that's climate, housing, burial grounds and burial sites, Indigenous knowledge is the policy statement we've just passed. So I encourage you to engage with us that way if you're having an issue in your community. And then finally, just to say, you know, we are raising awareness through a variety of means. I've been out in the community. I went to LA to it can be in a housing roundtable. Adrian was kind enough to participate along with a variety of both housing and preservation stakeholders. On June 20th, we'll be doing another one in New York City. If you happen to be in that area, hosted by the Furman Center. We'll be putting some information out on the ACHP channels shortly. We're always happy to be a partner with you. And just so you know where to find us, if you're not connected with us on these channels, multiple of which I do not have, but ACHP has, we encourage you to really to keep tabs on what we're doing and just make sure that you know that your voice is very important to us. We want to hear a lot from local preservationists, preservationists across the board, because we are trying to do a lot during a short amount of time. And we certainly appreciate your help and also your voice through NAPC, which is a great member and really brings that local perspective in their involvement with the Advisory Council. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker, I think. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. I think Abby's up next.
Yeah, let me see where. There we go. So thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. So before we go on to our second speaker today, I just want to take a moment to welcome everyone and give you a brief introduction to NAPC for some of you who may be unfamiliar with it. So NAPC is a nonprofit dedicated to helping build strong local preservation programs and leaders through education, training, and advocacy. We support the work of local preservation commissions and municipal planning staff through a variety of programs. These include our commission assistance and mentoring program known as CAMP, which provides customized in-person and virtual training to communities across the country. As part of that, we've also developed a specialized series of camp trainings on resilience and disaster planning. And those can either be a separate camp or included within our regular camps. We also have coming up Forum. So Forum is NAPC's biennial conference, and it's the only national conference focused on the issues facing local historic preservation commissions. So we will be in Florida this summer for Forum. Registration is now open, so encourage everyone to look into that. We also offer a virtual summer short course, which is a 2-day online training that occurs in the years that we don't have Forum. We do host webinars most months on a variety of topics, ranging from commission best practices to understanding architectural styles. We have the Alliance Review, which is our quarterly publication. Recent issues have included issues dedicated to affordable housing, which you can find in your handout tab, additions to historic buildings, cultural districts, and accessibility. We also have Listserv. It's a forum for commissioners and staff to ask questions and share information. And finally, another resource, last year we released a messaging guide to provide advocacy support to our members. And you can also find a copy of that in the handout tab. And later, after Adrian, Cindy Olnick is with us to be able to tell you a little bit more about that and be able to answer any questions you have about using the messaging guide. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Adrian now.
Great. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Sarah. I am going to kind of follow up from Sarah and talk about more from the state and local perspective, and specifically kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of this housing conversation, and look at it from a number of different perspectives. I will be pointing out kind of the challenges that we're dealing with when we're talking about housing, especially the nexus with preservation, but also how are we looking at new strategies, solutions? How are we helping on this issue? And also this idea that preservation finding its way or making its way within this broad, complicated conversation that we are for housing, and figuring out where do we fit into it. And I do believe we have a role. And I think that is part of the challenge in terms of inserting ourselves into the process. I will be looking at this certainly from a California perspective, and we're certainly a heightened example when we're talking about this issue of housing, affordable housing, although I think it translates to many of our communities and states across the country. There's definitely degrees of this issue and how it plays out, certainly from an urban-rural divide, but I think you'll see that there's a lot of commonality in a lot of what I'm going to be sharing. Also, I'll be looking at this and answering the question, do we have a housing problem? Do we have an affordable housing crisis? And certainly a lot of the work that we are doing in Los Angeles and California is very much focused on the latter around affordable housing. And I'll distinguish a little bit about how and why we're doing that and why that matters in terms of how it resonates. I'll look at a lot of like state, local streamlining measures. Certainly California is probably one of the leading states in terms of pressing for state legislation around housing, acceleration, and production. And what does that look like when it is landing on the ground in a local community? And then looking at this question of how do we fit into this larger conversation, the cast of characters around housing in terms of NIMBY, YIMBY discussions, anti-housing displacement and housing providers. And again, how do we figure out, do we collaborate? If we do collaborate, where's that common ground? And what does that look like when you are attempting to do that? And then lastly, I'll talk about how, at least in California, we're dividing this up into kind of three big parts. One, to better articulate this conversation, where does preservation fit in? And then also, what are some of the strategy solutions under each of these three categories, which I'll get into a lot more. And then lastly, again, the role of preservation and the larger community in terms of, I believe we need to insert ourselves into this conversation because I don't think we're necessarily being invited in naturally. This is in the handouts. So I just encourage you to take a look at this, download it, review it. It's a recent issue of the Alliance Review. And it's starting to touch on the conversation, again, preservation and the nexus with housing, certainly affordable housing, and what does that look like? So there's a lot of good resources out there, so please take a look at this, certainly from the National Alliance already. When we're talking about this issue of housing, I think we always need to root it in this idea. It's fundamentally about people. It's a very personal issue. It's about where we live or where will we live in terms of this conversation. It's easy to devolve into a conversation about housing units. And I think we miss something when we do that. And certainly a lot of the work in preservation is always about people and places. And so I think that's where we bring some value in terms of this conversation, that we're often working in neighborhoods that are dealing with housing challenges. And it's often dealing with communities that have been traditionally underserved, or they're dealing with speculative housing issues now, and also people that kind of fall under the radar in terms of BIPOC, other types of communities that don't have the same resources, don't have the same lived experiences, especially around housing, and have a limited voice. So that is part of this challenge. And also this issue of preservation is probably traditionally served more of a home ownership audience. And when we're talking about housing, especially what I'm talking about is mostly from a multifamily perspective, largely renter population. How do we provide and give them more voice in this conversation, and also make connections? This question of, do we have a housing crisis? I would be surprised if anybody agrees or thinks that we do not. There are varying degrees of what that looks like. I fully admit I'm not a data analyst. I'll leave that to other folks, but I can pull data and better extrapolate, well, what does this look like? And this is just one way of assessing what is the affordable housing problem and looking at the idea of rent burdened households. So just looking across the US, you get a pretty clear indication that many states, many counties, many localities are dealing with a massive amount of rent burden households, and then you have certainly an increase, even more so, in terms of severely rent burden households. So where they're spending an exorbitant amount of their personal income or gross income towards rent. So it's clear it's not just West Coast, East Coast, it's all over, and in terms of this issue. It's also this question that we're often confronted with, which I'm guessing many of you on this call are also confronted with, is this idea that it's framed as sort of a false choice, that it's either an either or rather than a both and, meaning that either we do preservation or we do affordable housing. And I think that is part of the fundamental problem with this, that it should be a both and, that we can do affordable housing and we can do preservation, and also they're often one and the same. But much of what we are seeing in terms of the conversation, certainly, I think nationally, but certainly in California and Los Angeles, is the idea that everything is focused on the production side. You know, build more, build more, build more. And less, or if any, is focused on the idea of keeping, retaining, and preserving what we already have. And I use broadly when I say preserving, because it's used in the housing world as well. Even beyond, you know, the way we think of preservation, with the idea of kind of housing providers adhere, or many of them adhere to this idea of the kind of the 3 Ps rule: protect tenants, preserve existing housing, and produce a new affordable housing. Those are all things that I think as a preservation community, we can embrace in figuring out how do we find those mutually aligned interests in terms of that conversation. It's also, and I will channel our good friend, Donovan Ripkema, in terms of this quote and in terms of the idea you can't build new and rent or sell cheap. That is part of the issue in terms of when the conversation about housing is in many ways slanted or predominantly focused on the idea of production and building and building and building, and not so much on the idea of retention, retaining, and preservation. We have a little bit of out of whack, but part of it is this issue of the economics don't work in terms of that. And I'll talk more about what this looks like, certainly some of the analysis that Don has done for us in Los Angeles, but this is a core part of the problem in terms of this idea. And there's a lot of varieties in terms of when you're talking about this issue of the economics. But if you just look at this example here, on the left, you have, in Los Angeles, we have rent stabilized housing or rent control, as a number of other cities from New York to DC and others have this kind of mechanism in terms of protecting the rights of renters and the ability for landlords or owners of these buildings to increase rents over time. So this is a typical example, probably 1920s or teens, multifamily housing building that is providing rent stabilized housing, affordable housing, essentially unsubsidized. The building on the right, the new construction, it may have some percentage of affordable housing units, but they're not the same. I think this is part of the issue, and I won't get into this in a lot of detail, but it's this idea of kind of, are we kicking the can down the road in terms of short-term gains versus long-term planning when we're talking about this issue of affordable housing? They're not equal in terms of the type of affordable housing. Rent stabilized housing is permanent. It's protected, but it's inherently linked to the building. So when we lose the building, we lose that rent stabilized housing that's contained within. What we're building is, at least in California primarily, is coveted or affordable housing with covenants, essentially. And in California, they tend to be 55 years. So yes, it's affordable housing, it's protected, but it's protected temporarily. So what are we doing for our kids or the next generation in terms of this temporary affordable housing we are creating, although not at the numbers we would like? And in the future, that will also go away. So in some cases, we're replacing existing affordable housing, replacing it with new types of affordable housing, but not equivalent affordable housing. And then there's certainly the issues of the life cycle cost of new construction versus old existing buildings. And also, are we building to the same level of quality of what we have now and we're potentially losing? So it's a broad, complicated conversation, but this certainly is a core aspect, I think, of this conversation when we're talking about strategies and solutions. It is also this idea that, you know, just building alone or production is the way to solve the problem. It's part of it, and it's a core part of it when we just look at the numbers side, that we're underserved in terms of what we're currently offering in terms of housing. But we also need to be talking again about the retention, preservation of existing housing, and looking at what are the factors driving this idea around production as being the only thing that we should be focused in, or not the only, but certainly the priority. In Los Angeles and in California overall, there are regional housing essentially mandates that set the number of housing units that need to be created over a period of time. So you see here, you know, in Los Angeles, we need to create about 456,000 new housing units between, well, 2021 and 2029. A percentage of those, 184,000 plus, must be affordable. That's incredibly difficult to achieve. So in Los Angeles and other cities, you have to show that you're able to accommodate this growth. So we're actually in the process of upzoning various parcels throughout the city to show that we can accommodate that amount of new housing. And currently we're targeting, specifically with the upzoning, parcels that will allow for an additional 250,000 new housing units. This is what it looks like also, the other aspect of this, and I'll get into how this plays out in terms of the legislative perspective, but this idea of single family zoning is not what it once used to be in terms of kind of a sacred aspect of land use zoning policy. It's now seen, when we're talking about housing, especially from some, as being a core part of the problem in terms of it's limiting growth, it's locking up land that otherwise could allow for greater density. There's also issues of, does it have racial undertones in terms of its origin story, and all that is part of and wrapped up in this conversation when we're talking about single family zoning. And you can look at various states, various cities that have essentially done away with single family land use. And there's certainly more than I'm listing here, but in many cases, and certainly California, every parcel of property can allow for more than one housing unit currently. So it's the types, it may be ADUs or accessory dwelling units, maybe junior accessory dwelling units, or it may be allowing for duplexes. There's lots of different aspects in terms of how you're looking at land use fundamentally in a much different way than we used to. It also raises questions about unintended results of this in terms of greater speculation, in terms of these properties, now that they allow for greater density, it may actually increase the value of these properties. So it makes it less affordable for somebody trying to buy a single family home. Certainly the idea of a starter home doesn't really exist, certainly in a place like California or most parts of California, where I think the median house now in California is around 900,000. So you look at this, and you also, the other aspect of this is that you may be increasing density like you see in the property here adjacent to the single family home. How much of that is market rate versus affordable? That's part of the discussion that we're having. It's also this question of the zero-sum game of how much are we adding versus how much are we subtracting? And much of the conversation, as I said before, is about production. So we're doing a really good job in terms of saying we're creating this many new units. What we're not doing so well or reporting on or even tracking is the number of existing affordable units are we losing. And I'll talk more about this idea of naturally occurring affordable housing, but that's often within older and historic buildings. And we're losing those sometimes to gain new housing, but maybe we're losing more of the affordable versus what we're gaining of the new affordable in the new construction. So again, it's not often being tracked in terms of kind of what we're losing, what we're gaining. And to illustrate this, I am certainly not a math person, but I can do adding and subtracting. And if you just look at some of the track record in terms of the number of affordable housing units that we've lost in Los Angeles, 26,000 plus, in DC, it's 18,000 plus. And then over a period of time, nationally, 13 million housing units have been lost. Should all of those have been kept? Probably not, but it's this question of what are we doing here when we're talking about housing? why are we losing housing when we're supposed to be gaining housing in terms of this idea of production as well as retention? They're not balanced in terms of a lot of the policies that are established either at the state level or certainly at the local level in terms of priorities. And that's something I think we need to all change and look at this issue. It's also this question that we hear a lot is this idea of kind of the trickle down theory, that if you build more housing, it will free up other types of housing to be more affordable. Does this actually work? I think there's some debate certainly on this question, especially if we're not building more affordable housing equivalent to what we're losing. If we're building a lot of market rate, which we are doing, certainly in Los Angeles and I would say in other parts of California, in terms of market or even luxury housing units that are not equivalent to what we're getting rid of. And it also brings up the question of displacement, vacancy, prompting calls for things like a vacancy tax in some communities to deal with this issue in terms of what are we actually gaining versus what we're losing. And then you see how it plays out in neighborhoods in terms of kind of this haphazard hodgepodge transformation of neighborhoods. But again, the loss of affordable housing for the gain of additional housing, but is it affordable? So it's this kind of balancing issue in terms of what are we producing? And again, most of it is market rate. How do we increase those numbers so there's more affordable, at least in terms of this loss that we may be experiencing in our communities? The other aspect I've touched on is this idea that in most of our cities, whether it's rural and urban around the country, the highest concentration of existing affordable housing is contained within older and historic buildings and historic neighborhoods. And it's this idea that we are already providing a major source of critical affordable housing in already dense neighborhoods. Again, this idea of naturally occurring affordable housing. And we shouldn't be throwing this resource away, should actually be reinvesting it, which is what's happening in this image here of a half of a bungalow court that's being rehabilitated to continue its use for critical housing in terms of the community. We did a study a few years, no, it's been more than a few years, in terms of looking at this issue, the economics and the impact of preservation, again, by Don Ripkema with Place Economics. And asking this question, and Sarah, you alluded to it, in terms of how do we fit into this conversation around density? How do we fit in this conversation around, are we providing affordable housing? And one of the things that was surprising even to us, we have a lot of local historic districts, about 35 local historic districts across the city. And some of those districts are clearly predominantly single family. A lot of those districts have a mix of single family and multifamily. And one of the things that was surprising even to us was nearly 40% of the housing in the aggregate of all local historic districts in Los Angeles is providing multifamily apartments of 5 units or more. So we are providing a critical source of existing affordable housing and also a critical source of density that's denser than other similar non-designated neighborhoods in the city, or denser overall in comparison to the city overall. It's also the issue of we have greater tenure of residents and a stability and diversity of residents in our local historic districts, in part because they are stable neighborhoods and they have that kind of protection in terms of the design review mechanism. This brings up this question of, is any and all housing and density preferable to ensure affordability? And I think as you see it play out on the ground, again, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of what we're seeing. And I know I'm showing various examples. Some are egregious, some are, extreme, although this is pretty typical, quite honestly, across certainly in the city of LA, that we are seeing on a routine basis in the types of new housing that's being developed. Does it reinforce existing neighborhood character? Does it push out existing low-income residents? And I quote a piece here from the NAPC messaging guide, which Cindy is going to talk more about, but it is this issue of like, how are we providing for especially our vulnerable low-income residents in some of these neighborhoods with these types of new developments? Does it push in? Does it help them in terms of this type of almost a domino effect as this plays out in a neighborhood? Inherently, density is not a bad thing, and I think we often say at the LA Conservancy is we're in support of density. It's about how we add density, either through a thoughtful, carefully calibrated planning approach, or is it a blunt approach in terms of that is more of a one-size-fits-all that doesn't reinforce existing neighborhood values or character, or involves the residents. So it's either something that feels like it's happening to them. How do we make this so it's more happening with them? And how do we carefully add density in a way that's thoughtful and reinforces preservation values? Having said that, I think it's also this question that, and as Sarah was talking about around the standards, is we probably need more flexibility and also to be open to things that are less perfect when we're talking about this issue of adding housing. And we are certainly confronting this, and this is what we may accept in Los Angeles may not be the right thing to accept in Cleveland or in Miami. Every city has to kind of figure out what is the balance in terms of what does a win-win look like. And some of this is like less precious preservation, imperfect preservation, trying to achieve the balance between some preservation and also adding more housing, especially when it's affordable housing. I think we don't always have like the perfect outcomes, but I think that's part of what we need to be looking at when we're looking at this issue of how do we increase density, increase housing, also allow for preservation and find those win-win outcomes. They may not look like perfect preservation. Shifting now slightly to this question of statewide, local policy setting. What does this look like in terms of this question of we're seeing legislative policies, mandates that are now trickling down to the local level, essentially changing up the way in which we do land use planning, zoning. And often these are very blunt instruments, and we're seeing them on an annual legislative cycle basis, multiple bills that are being passed. Some are in conflict with one another, and it makes it very complicated to understand what is the current way of doing planning, because it can change every single year in terms of process. But often these bills are, again, pressing for greater density, streamlining from environmental review, more flexibility in terms of how this can occur, and again, predictability in terms of speeding up the process. And this looks like in lots of different ways. Like I say, it often is a very blunt tool in terms of what this looks like. And I like what the American Planning Association says here is that we need to take care not to introduce new uses that could distort housing markets and lead to forced displacement of existing residents. That's part of the concern with some of these tools, that they are not so thoughtful in terms of how that's happening. And so we're trying to work and be part of the solution, be part of bills in a more proactive way rather than just reacting to bills and as they look out. It's also happening at the local level. So one example here is the city of Los Angeles through an executive directive called ED1 by the mayor that she put in place, Mayor Bass, when she came into office in 2022, essentially streamlining for projects that are producing 100% affordable housing production, which is a great intent in terms of those are some of the hardest to finance. And if we can make some greater flexibility to ensure they come online and they can meet the need, as well as closing the gap in terms of the financing that often comes with the time and money that goes with less streamlined approaches. The problem with some of these, again, very blunt in this particular example, and I won't get into the details, but essentially it overrides, or potentially would override, design review mechanisms and protections within local historic districts. And it's a very black and white type of policy, or at least it is so far as we're trying to work through this approach. And what it does is it forces the preservation community in the corner where we're asking for exemptions. You can do this, but not in local historic districts, which is not an ideal from an optic standpoint, and immediately you're misconstrued as being part of the NIMBY or not in my backyard community. Which does bring up this question of the divide between the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs, and how do we find some common ground in terms of this conversation. And it's complex, it's challenging. in terms of how we do this. It's also this idea that in many of our cities, there's a lot of room to grow. And certainly we know in LA, we've been able to do an analysis, and we know the historic concentrations and the historic resources represent about 7% of the overall city of 880,000 parcels. So there's a lot of area of the city does not contain historic places. However, the caveat to that is a lot of those historic resources are located in close-in neighborhoods, close to transit, and areas where you do want to have a lot of people living, and it does put pressure on these resources. We are trying to, again, have conversations and build some support, and also find common ground and collaboration where typically perhaps YIMBYs and NIMBYs don't talk so much. And there's also the aspect here, not all YIMBYs or Yes in My Backyard groups are the same in terms of the degree of how they approach and how they look at preservation. Same goes for preservation groups. We have a range or a spectrum. This is an example. It's Assembly Bill 3068 introduced this year, or as part of the legislative session in California. It's essentially an office to housing conversion bill, but Assemblymember Matt Haney, part of his goal was he wanted to bring the YIMBY and the preservation community together as part of this bill. So between the LA Conservancy, the California Preservation Foundation, and YIMBY Action, we spent a number of months meeting regularly to talk about this bill, to bring in experts to talk about how we could strengthen it, and also insert and include that there were some preservation safeguards to get to the place where the bill's been introduced. It now is sponsored in part with California Preservation Foundation and YIMBY Action. And again, showing how there's some common ground, specifically around this idea of converting empty office buildings for housing. I'm going to end on this issue of this idea of the three aspects that we've broken out in terms of how we're trying to make sense of this issue of housing and preservation, and what does it look like, again, with this idea of these three components. I'll go through these quickly because I know we're short on time a little bit here. But the first one is this idea of adaptive reuse and how we're expanding into the conversation around office to residential conversions. And Sara set this up beautifully in terms of this conversation. We have a long track record. We have a lot of credibility in this conversation. You know, nearly 40 states have state-level tax credit programs. Some of them have a specific benefit or a bonus if you're doing affordable housing production. We probably need more of those kinds of things. And it's often, you know, we're pairing or twinning these with the low-income housing tax credits. So, you know, we have the history in terms of doing this. You know, downtown Los Angeles, we've created 12,000 new housing units. Admittedly, those are primarily market rate, but we're also showing examples, and there's across the country where we've adapted buildings for affordable housing. And now we're talking about this latest debate in terms of how do we make office to residential work when we have such a glut of vacancy in terms of office, and which buildings make sense, which buildings don't, and how do we close the gap in terms of the financing to make those viable. And also look at some of our existing tools that we've been relying on need an update. And certainly that's what LA is doing in terms of its long-standing adaptive reuse ordinance, which was passed in 1999. It's now looking at 2.0 version, expanding it citywide, very much focused on the affordable housing issue, providing greater flexibility, greater utilization, some new mechanisms that are much more enticing in terms of making projects pencil out. So it's also, again, how do we update the tools that we've been using for some time? It's also this idea, the second part is infill, you know, doing density without demolition. We've got examples here where we're adding infill, we're doing ADUs, and we're keeping the existing buildings is a core part of this conversation. How do we do it in a thoughtful, calibrated planning approach? Or this example of a garden apartment development in Los Angeles, historic garden apartment that was initially slated for complete demolition. Fast forward some years, and part of the plan was it was protected as a locally designated historic landmark, but it was also protected with the idea of adding more density or infill buildings carefully inserted in terms of the overall site and getting to nearly the same amount of units that was originally proposed through the demolition and redevelopment of the site. So again, finding those win-win approaches when we can in terms of looking at this issue. And certainly it's the idea of how do we be more surgical and thoughtful in terms of how do we add density, and the whole idea of accessory dwelling units or ADUs. It's by right in California, and we're increasingly offering more of these, and you're seeing this in terms of increased production in terms of across the state. There is the question, how many of these are actually being used for affordable housing? So there is a limitation in terms of that particular issue. And then lastly, this issue of naturally occurring affordable housing. What does it look like? In all of our cities, we have it. It's manifested in different types. And it's, again, in some places, it's also the locations of where you have rent-controlled housing, if you have that type of mechanism. But it exists. It's existing buildings that are providing a critical need in terms of affordable housing. When we lose those, we lose a critical source in terms of that. You can't build it back in terms of the production. And it looks like many different things. This example is naturally occurring affordable housing and some new infill development, but more of a home ownership model in terms of ensuring that low income or moderate income, workforce income residents can actually buy versus just the idea that you have to rent when we're looking at these conversations. Or this example, we're seeing many more examples in terms of intervention to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing from this NOAA in terms of the idea of acquisition and financing rehab so that you're protecting them, because they're increasingly vulnerable through demolition and redevelopment in terms of different examples. And also going back to the people. It's often about people, low-income people of color that are most impacted when these types of housing are destabilized or lost, and looking at different examples. And there's a natural, again, intersection with preservation and historic resources. And so there's lots of great examples in terms of new programs being developed, from community land trust to other types of co-ownership models that are coming online. And it's about the question of, are we engaging in those conversations in our communities to try to help? Because again, it's impacting largely older and historic housing stock when we're talking about this conversation. So to wrap up, I hopefully covered these 5 things in terms of this conversation. And I will again just reiterate, it's a complicated conversation, especially at the local level and at the state level. When we're talking about housing, it's not one thing, it's many things. And also understanding that we have to give a little bit, but also how do we ensure that we are part of this conversation and moving preservation forward with the housing conversation, rather than the housing conversation going alone without us or overriding us. And again, how do we find the common ground in terms of this complicated conversation and ensure fundamentally the work that we're doing is relevant in terms of meeting the need in the moment where we're at right now? So I'm going to end there, and I will turn it over to Cindy to talk a little bit about the messaging guide.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I don't have any slides, and everything you need to know about the messaging guide is in the messaging guide. So I know you all have tons of free time to peruse the 90 or so pages. So, but in a nutshell, I've been looking at the Q&A, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the most upvoted Q is about positioning ourselves, right? We know we have an issue with that. And kudos to NAPC for recognizing that this isn't going to fix itself. So a couple of years ago, they brought me on to create this messaging guide. I went to the forum in 2022 and talked with many of you about what your biggest challenges were. And we did a survey and everything else. And overwhelmingly, it was conveying the value of preservation. In this case, it was also demystifying the local preservation process and advocating for more effective policy and practice, or more effective implementation. And so, long story short, we did put together the guide. We had dozens of peer reviewers from across the country. Some of you are here today. Thank you so much for volunteering your time to make this a much better guide. And we released it last July, August, September, something like that. It's all sort of a blur. So anyway, so there's so much in there. It's got general communications tips, but it also has talking points and the most recent data. We're not great on the data, but the most recent verifiable data that we could find, so that we're not continuing to perpetuate sort of outdated statistics and stuff. But we clearly need a lot more research. But it covers general stuff. It covers very specific issues. It covers including housing. So that's why I'm here today, to answer any housing related messaging questions. But again, I want to say that this came out a year ago, and so it has a lot of examples and links and things that will change or have changed, but the principles remain the same. And if you take one thing away from today on the messaging side, it's about showing, not telling, as every one of our speakers, as Sara and Adrian have said earlier. So if you focus your messaging on one thing, it's just share stories of what works. And you know that you have either examples in your own town or nearby or in similar comparable cities. And we need to do a better job of compiling and sharing those examples. But for now, just show, don't tell, because there's a lot of stuff in the guide about myth busting that can backfire on you. Just telling somebody something important is sort of meaningless, right? And consider the source, right? So if you can just show case studies and examples of what works, I think that goes a long, long way. And don't assume that anyone knows what you know. I have been surprised at my level. We do this stuff every day. We love it. Well, we're passionate about it. We know it inside and out. And so many people have no idea about any of the stuff that's going on. There is amazing work going on, and it has been for a long time, but people don't know about it. So if you think of a story that you're like, well, everybody knows about that, they don't. So just start basic. Basic is good, basic is fine. What is the most high profile example you could think of that the most people will find relevant and personally connect to? So just start there. And I'm doing a workshop at this coming forum in Florida, and we're going to go into much more depth about the guide and how people are using it or not, or what needs to be changed, or what are we learning from it. This is a really long game. Changing how we talk about preservation in America is a really long game, but we have to start somewhere. So this is a great start. So and I will just say one more thing, which is it's not about spinning or convincing people. It's really not. It's about conveying our values, as Sara said. We all have certain values that are authentic, and so it's just about conveying those values and connecting your work to people's everyday lives. So those are just a few chestnuts, and I'm going to stop talking so we can take some questions.
Thanks, Cindy. I seem to think that most people now can start to see through some of the spin. So I like your idea, just convey the value. And those stories are so critical. I don't know if Sara was able to join again by telephone. If you're there, Sara, let us know. She had to step away from the camera. But we'll get started on some of these questions, and maybe she can join in. You mentioned, Cindy, one of the top questions in the Q&A was exactly about messaging. And Adrian, you talked about Bill 3068 as a kind of a legislative way that you were able to bring together the YIMBY and the NIMBY groups and get them talking. Are there other ways that preservationists can best position themselves between these two groups, or maybe it's not between them, but how do we start to bridge that divide and speak with both of them? You're on mute.
Thank you. I think it speaks a little bit to the question that Patrick asked in terms of, and so many people kept raising it in terms of, because I agree, it's core to this issue is that let's talk. We need to be talking with everybody. And it's very easy to get pigeonholed in terms of, well, you're about this, you don't care about that. And I think that when you start having conversations and start meeting and figuring out, well, okay, we actually do have some common ground there. We may have different approaches and we have more degrees of how we look at this. It's also the issue that not all groups are the same. And that's the area too, that I think it was really helpful to have the conversation, a prolonged conversation with the YIMBY organization that we were working with to better understand how they look at preservation, but also for them they were learning about preservation through us. And so it's that kind of symbiotic kind of conversation that needs to happen more often. We definitely have some, as Patrick relates, aggressive level YIMBY organizations that maybe don't want to embrace, or don't want to engage with the preservationists. And likewise, we have some members within preservation that don't want to have anything to do with YIMBYs and think that we shouldn't be talking with them or collaborating with them. And then there's the whole housing, tenant rights organizations as well, which is a whole nother aspect that we should be building some conversations and connections with as well. So part of it is just old-fashioned getting to know one another and figuring out where you have some common interests. We always say meet the community where it's at when we're talking about working with communities, but it's also this idea of meeting these various groups where they're at and figuring out how do we listen more, and again, figure out how we could be maybe working towards the same goals when possible. It's not always possible, but we should be at least striving towards that.
We need to at least try, right? And it's so hard in today's world with as much division as there is. But I think that there are ways to bridge that through conversations. And I wanted to thank you, Adrian, for bringing up the renter situation. When I think of underrepresented communities, there are certain communities that go straight to our mind, right? But we often forget the renters. It's not all about homeownership. And especially when it comes to housing, vast majority, it is rental populations. And so thanks for bringing that up in your presentation. We've had a couple of questions about financing. Both Karen and Michelle asked questions about financing sources related to this in both urban and rural areas. And I think, again, rural areas are often underrepresented in the housing conversation. Could anyone speak to that? Are there ways that the Advisory Council or local, state, federal governments programs can encourage or facilitate financing?
Sarah's probably the better source for this, but I do think it comes down to where our priorities being set, and so much of it, again, like I've said, is on production, which it should be, but it's also like, how do we provide more financing resources on the retention, reinvestment, and preservation of existing housing, affordable housing, however you want to define that. But that's often at the federal level that you're seeing the core funding established and then trickling down to the states and the locals. California, we're now facing, a fiscal deficit. So a lot of the funding that we relied on until just, a couple of years ago is now dried up. So it's forcing us to think, okay, now how do we do this in terms of this? So, but yeah, it's all about the money in terms of making it work.
Cindy, do you have some thoughts on how we could be talking with our elected officials related to this issue?
Sure. And I am not a political animal, but I've been in the room for a few minutes and I've seen the great work that Adrian and Cindy at the California Preservation Foundation and people around the nation have been doing. And it's about showing up, right? It's about doing the boring stuff, right? It's about going to zoning meetings, right? Who has interest or time in that? But it's about understanding, what is behind the decisions, right? Building relationships, and again, showing examples. I mean, I'm working on a separate project right now on a set of infographics. Stay tuned, coming soon to a website near you that preservationists nationwide can use for free to connect their work with these issues. And one of the use cases is one sheets for elected officials, right? So, any way you have to tell a story, and the messaging guide talks about reaching different audiences. And, it's generalizing, right? It's getting to know your electeds, which is a ton of work, as Adrian, I'm sure, can attest, because then they change and you have to do it again. But and their planning staff, right? And so it's about finding what projects in their district. It's about getting stories of their constituents. Anything that can make them, pay more attention. What's the personal connection to them, and then again, just showing what's possible.
I'll just add to that a little bit, Barbara. The legislation that I had mentioned, AB 3068. Again, it was the legislator, the elected official, that was motivated to want to bring the YIMBY and the preservation communities together to have a conversation. So, we need to find out, what is motivating various elected officials around this issue of housing. And we might actually be surprised that they actually may care more around some of the values that we share in terms of preservation. But, we need to let them know that we care about this issue of housing, and also insert ourselves in these conversations and get comfortable with being uncomfortable in a topic that I think many of us are a bit intimidated about, quite honestly, because we don't know the language. We are not housing providers. We're not necessarily CDC nonprofits. Some of us are. So I think it is forcing us to get out of that, what we know, into a world that will have benefits for, once we do that in many different ways.
And you don't have to use the word preservation.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Don't hide what you're doing. But again, and there's a whole page on that in the guide, but we all know, right, that it's a 4-letter word to many people. But talk about existing places, right? It's like we're using what we have. It just makes sense. And is it easy? No. Is it worth it? Yes. Why? So yeah, just talking. If you walk in and you say, "Hi, I'm with preservation," that can immediately shut down, right? But if you can use any sort of language to at least cause a break, like Rethos in Minnesota uses, they call it the new preservation, which is, at least it uses one little word just to sort of say, what is that? And then you have the chance to explain it more fully. So.
Great, thanks. I understand Sara is back online, or at least via phone. Can you speak with us, Sara?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful.
I just have lost my video, but
that's okay.
Looks like we finally made it through the chat. But I'm here.
All right.
I'm happy to weigh in on that question, actually, from the federal level, in that there are certainly bills that are happening that are being proposed by housing advocates that I know preservation advocates, to Adrian's point earlier, they're maybe not consulted at the outset. And so there is a need to insert ourselves into conversations at every level and bring some of the language and the strategies that we've been talking about today. And I think that is, it's on us. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Sara. The next top upvoted thing has to do with research and data, and there's a number of other questions lower down in the Q&A that are related. What kind of research and data do we need? What kind of tools do we need? There were some comments about, is it a matter of putting more fines on demolition of existing housing stock, or is there a need for permitting tracking for demolitions? Adrian, I know we always talk about the new housing that's built, but are we tracking the demolitions to begin with, right? There was also mention of vacancy tax. What kind of tools and research should we be doing, and how can we support housing production and affordability with those tools?
I'll just add that in our housing statement, we actually have a call for more research. And what we talk about there is research related to existing government programs, so laws, incentives, affordability requirements at the local, state, and federal levels. We talk about historic properties and neighborhoods. We actually, I harp on this in many of my presentations, we don't know where historic resources are. We do not have an integrated map of local districts, of state registered, districts, of national registered districts. We don't have one that can really show us where the historic places are. That makes it all the more hard for us to evaluate links between historic properties and affordability, between historic properties and displacement, between historic properties and their location in environmental justice communities. There's all kinds of impacts on the real estate market, including short-term rentals that we have not studied well. And I would say, you raise a couple of questions in your prompt. Those are extremely important. I do just want to add the question of workforce as well. The issues of, do we have enough people to do what we want to do? And if we don't, how do we generate that? And the Campaign for Historic Trades and other people and organizations all over the country are working on this question, but that really hasn't gotten the traction that it deserves. And I think it's a part of this question.
I would just add to that, also is this issue of predictability. And in our conversations with both elected officials and certainly housing folks, is that's what they want. And developers and everyone, they want predictability. They want the streamline, which I don't think we're inherently should ever be seen as like anti-streamlining, because sometimes there's stuff that just doesn't make sense, that slows down and drives up costs. But it is this question of predictability. But I know when we've had these conversations, when we're either responding to a legislative bill or we're trying to promote something as a new bill on its own, there's this inherent conversation that comes up, and we have to explain the issue. Well, there's designated properties. Well, we may have a survey, or we may not have an up-to-date survey. Well, those are eligible properties. How do we protect, put safeguards for all these very nuanced kind of aspects? So I think part of what Sarah's saying, if anything that should come from this conversation, is having more funding to be able to do survey, inventory, to identify where resources, so we can have better planning and predictability, would be a great outcome to this conversation around housing, so that we do know, like, where do we have it, and then how do we plan for it.
Yeah, great point, Adrian. The next top upvoted question is from Jim, and it has to do with the solution for post-war housing. And there's something that we have to still do survey on too, right? So it kind of comes right in. Neighborhoods from the 50s and onward tend to be low density, wider, shallower lots, and have overall poor transportation connectivity. Is there a solution or examples in the climate and resilience, housing resiliency that works in post-war neighborhoods? And so many of those are single-family dwellings, right?
It's, as I said, it's complicated when we're talking about this issue. And it's also, what do you value in your community? Which of those neighborhoods rise in terms of that you want to see preserved? That, in some cases, those are being completely redeveloped, or they already have been through the traditional kind of mansionization teardown process, which is anything but affordable housing, or adding denser, just bigger houses. But it is this question, how do you insert greater density even into post-war neighborhoods? There's no reason why you couldn't allow for multiple units on some of those sites, more ADUs. We need to be open to things like that that can still maintain the look and feel of a post-war, mid-century modern neighborhood. We're certainly seeing malls, the dead mall kind of issue, or commercial strip centers being redeveloped. And in some of those cases, it makes sense that it's not a good use of land in terms of where you could add greater density and offer more housing options and, supply. And how do we balance that? So it comes down to planning, but also setting your priorities in your community. But it shouldn't be something that we should immediately say we're anti, density or growth in those areas as well, because they should be part of the equation.
I'll just add too, from a climate perspective, since that was embedded in the question, that one issue that I think a lot of post-war developments have is that, even as they age into historic status, their materials sometimes don't age as well. So you do see some energy inefficient windows and things like that, especially, we all know 60s, 70s, 80s, even. And one issue for federal agencies we've tried to encounter is how do you upgrade these buildings in a sensitive way? I would encourage people, there's pros and cons of doing things the way we have done them in the past, but in the past, the Advisory Council has issued a series of what I've referred to before as program comments on Army housing in particular. And you might be able, including Vietnam War era housing and different years of housing. And you might mine those in the appendices in particular for some strategies federal agencies are using to evaluate these types of post-war structures and developments, in that case, military housing, but at a bigger scale, and for climate and energy efficiency type issues.
And Sarah, hasn't the Advisory Council issued a statement on climate change as well?
Yes. So over the summer of last year, July, the Advisory Council adopted its climate change and historic preservation policy statement, which focuses on mitigation and the role of historic preservation and flexible standards, again, going back to that, in ensuring that historic buildings can reduce their carbon impact. They're already reusing them is already carbon positive it's not more carbon. There's embodied energy in the buildings, so reusing them is good for the environment. But we can make them even more energy efficient. And we also talk a lot about adaptation. So what do we do about sea level rise? And by the way, lots of housing, including military housing, big issues there related to sea level rise and historic housing. We see that all over the country too.
Yeah. And Erin, I see your comment in the chat about dead malls. I'm a Gen X preservationist, and I think some of those dead malls can be reused pretty nicely. So I think there's some interesting things that we could even be doing housing within those dead malls. Well, we are just about at the end of our time here. I'm going to close out with some closing remarks, and I'll stay on for a few minutes longer. So I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. If you want to continue the conversation about housing and historic preservation and NAPC's messaging guide, please join us in West Palm Beach this summer for our biennial conference forum. Early bird registration rates will end after June 3rd, so that's just a little over a week away. I don't know what happened to May, but it's almost that time already. So take advantage of these lower rates while you still can. NAPC and their local preservation partners have planned some amazing educational sessions, special events, tours, and pre-conference workshops. Make sure to sign up for tours and workshops before they fill up. For a preview of what to expect, check out the forum webpage. All attendees of today's live session will automatically receive a certificate of completion via email later this afternoon. If you do not see it by Monday morning, please be sure to check your spam inbox and your promotions folders. If you're watching this webinar on demand, you will automatically receive a certificate of completion when you complete the recording. NAPC is going to be taking a short break from our monthly webinar series in June and July to focus on Forum, but we'll be back in August. And in the meantime, we hope to see you this summer at Forum 2024, Preservation Under the Palms. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Bye. Thanks.